Welcome, everyone. My name is Derek. I'm with Syntax, and today we're going to be talking about audio networking, specifically unraveling the differences and comparing and contrasting MADI, Dante, and AVB. So, thank you for being here. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, please feel free to type questions right there in the chat, and we will try to address them as we go. And for those of you that are here for CTS Avixa credits, at the end, I will give you instructions on how you can get those certificate that you can register with Avixa. So without further ado, let's talk about network audio. So before we had audio networking, we had things like multi-channel audio snakes, like for live sound, studio, and broadcast. And it used to mean analog copper snakes for running lots of audio channels around a venue, for example, or a studio. And they're prone to hum and ground loops and audio quality issues. So, over the last 20 years, and more recently, the last 10, there have been several audio formats developed. And today, here in 2021, I think we can agree that these three are probably the most widely used in commercial installations, in the studio, in venues, live sound, broadcast, etc. So Dante, AVB, and MADI. Of course, these don't have the ground loop problems and the signal quality issues that copper analog cabling would have. So that's a huge advantage of these systems. And before we get into the differences, I want to sort of go through each format differently. And of course, all of these have that one thing in common: being able to do high channel counts in large complex systems, distributing the audio, and all those kinds of things. So we're going to cover the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So we're going to start with MADI. MADI stands for multi audio digital interface. It's a 64 audio channel unidirectional data stream. In typical applications, 24-bit 48K. So the sample rate is important when knowing how many audio channels MADI has. Why MADI? Why is MADI used when Ethernet and audio networking has become so prevalent? Well, the answer is it's a point-to-point protocol. So it works like connecting analog cables. It's also extremely easy to use for low latencies and across short and long distances. Also, MADI is still used everywhere. So people are aware of it, or especially in live applications. It's still used on a lot of digital consoles and stage racks and stuff like that. It's been used in lots of different places for lots of audio channels in a facility. And these are just a few examples: Olympics and Super Bowl halftime show and tour sound, Broadway, Cirque du Soleil in Las Vegas, for example. Also, with MADI, there are two types of cables: there's optical MADI, and there's coax MADI. The optical MADI cable looks like this. The coax MADI is your typical 75 ohm BNC cable. Now, the cable you're looking at there is a duplex MADI cable where the in and the out are sort of held together with a plastic connector, but you can also get simplex MADI cable where it would just be one of those by itself. MADI also comes in two forms: single mode, multi-mode. Multi-mode is more common in terms of just everyday application. Single mode is most common in broadcast, where we have to run cable distances greater than 10,000 meters. Multi-mode, we can run up to 2,000 meters. A lesser known fact about MADI is that there is something called signal embedding. There's daisy chaining capability. So in this picture, we have an 8-channel microphone preamp that is the MADI out is connected to the MADI in, and it's daisy chained all the way through. And you can actually set what is known as a MADI device ID number, which will synchronize all of those units together. So it's one comprehensive synchronous system. So in this slide that you're looking at, it's an 8-channel mic pre times 8. So we're getting 64 total channels of MADI by the time we get to the end. And it's all in perfect synchronization with itself. MADI is very much plug and play, just like analog or, say, digital coax, SPDIF coax or SPDIF optical or ADAT optical. We're sort of accustomed to just connecting the cable and there's audio. There's nothing to configure. There's no switches. Thus, it is very useful in live and critical situations where you want that immediate audio to be there. Also, with the MADI, a MADI network, there's really no centralized configuration. With Dante and AVB, there are things like Dante and AVB controllers where you have to discover all the devices on the network and do some centralized configuration. With MADI, it's like connecting your digital out of your CD player to a digital input on a console. You just make the connection, and then devices themselves can be configured for what the master clock is, or if you're doing daisy chaining with the MADI device ID. So there's really no centralized configuration in MADI. Now, with MADI, there is something known as seamless redundancy. So if you have a piece of hardware that supports MADI, you might see a MADI in and out that's labeled primary and a secondary. And that's because we can have seamless MADI redundancy with the MADI IO. So if something happens to the MADI input on the primary port, it will immediately switch over to the secondary port, and it's done in a seamless way. So there's no interruption in the audio. So MADI is used for purposes of this webinar, just so people know, MADI is used in critical applications where, we have quick setup and breakdown, quick audio is needed, quick synchronization. So you're going to find it in these live audio concert broadcast situations for that reason. Now, I want to kind of put the MADI thing on the shelf, and we're going to come back to it, and now switch gears to network audio format known as AVB. Stands for audio video bridging, requires network switches, and it is an open standard. What does that mean to the everyday user of audio networks? Well, it just means that the manufacturers do not have to pay a license fee to adopt AVB into their hardware. Thus, that fee is not passed on to the end user. So that is an advantage depending on how you want to look at that. AVB has several network components. There are talkers and listeners. Another way to think of it is as outputs and inputs. But that cable, that single Ethernet cable, has the ins and the outs. So unlike MADI, where you have an output jack and an input jack, like much of analog, AVB is one port, and you have your input and your output. You also have an AVB switch, which has to comply to the IEEE 802 standards. If you were to just go into your everyday web browser and search AVB compatible switch, you'll find websites from Biamp and PreSonus and other manufacturers who have adopted AVB, and you'll see a list of, it's very easy to find, of switches that comply to AVB. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute as it relates to guaranteed bandwidth. Also with AVB, you have a stream, and that stream is a little different than MADI and Dante. With AVB, you get to the person configuring the network can set up the stream as to how many audio channels it will have and what sample rate it will be. And you can have, most hardware and most configurations of AVB allow you to have multiple streams on that AVB network. And in the case of a single piece of hardware with a single Ethernet port, with a single cable connected to it, you might define 3 or 4 streams on that one Ethernet cable. One stream might be 2-channel, another one might be 16-channel, another one might be 32-channel. So the stream definition process in AVB is a little different. With MADI, it's one stream, 24-bit, 48K, you got 64 channels. With AVB, well, it depends. With Dante, it depends on the hardware. Is it, most people think of Dante as a 64 channel stream, and we'll get into Dante in a second, but with AVB, it's definitely different. Now, a typical network example would be a local area network of AVB talkers and listeners, all interconnected with an IEEE 802 compatible switch. And you would open up a piece of software known as AVB controller. Many manufacturers have their own AVB controller software that comes with their product, and you open it up and it would discover these devices and allow you to connect outputs to inputs and stuff like that. So this would be a typical example. Now with AVB, typical implementations, not all, but many, are 128 channels bidirectionally. So if it's a converter, if it's a console, a stage rack, a digital console is what I meant, you might have up to 128 channels of AVB, and that could be, 3 streams of 32 channels. It could be different stream definitions, but typical implementations. And AVB enables a transmission of hundreds of channels on the network. We can do sample rates up to 192, and theoretically, we can have different sample rates on the same network with an AVB. So going back to those streams, you could have one stream operating at 48K, and theoretically, you could have another stream operating at 96K. Can't do that with MADI or Dante. Now, there are not as many companies adopting AVB that have adopted MADI or have adopted Dante, but there's still quite a few. And the whole idea is that it's seamless integration. Control protocols are in there to be able to control other manufacturers' equipment as long as the manufacturers have written such software. So it's all built into the spec. Just it's all hardware dependent on what you're doing. And AVB uses reserve bandwidth. So other network activity doesn't disturb AVB audio. So if you're creating a network for AVB, you do not have to have a separate network just for audio. So one of the advantages of AVB is that if you have to use an existing network, you can, because the AVB protocol is a reserve bandwidth network. So anything else going on the network, it will not disturb the audio. That is why you have to get an AVB compatible switch that can perform to enable to do that. AVB, the latency across the network is fixed, so nothing is going to change the latency. It's always there, no matter how much network activity there is. And all of the endpoints on the network are time aligned. It's a time sensitive network. And because AVB is designed the way it is, it will support higher bandwidths with future devices. So as the IT equipment becomes better, faster, more bandwidth, AVB can grow right along with it. And in theory, there's not really much configuration when you're using a AVB compatible device. As far as the switches go, you shouldn't have to configure them. You should be able to just plug in the equipment, and the only configuration you should have to do is your AVB controller or the hardware itself. Just define the stream, number of channels for the stream, the sample rate, the normal basic things that you would do for any network. Okay, let's talk about Dante for a second. So with Dante, it's very similar network components. We have transmitters and receivers opposed to talkers and listeners, but they're basically the same thing as AVB. You have outputs and inputs. You can use a layer 3 switch, so a more basic switch is adequate for Dante. This is also why many integrators will separate their Dante network from their regular computer network, meaning they'll purchase additional switches and set up a Dante network as a separate network unto itself. There's some cost associated with that, obviously, but that's what they do. The Dante stream is typically expressed, and it's hard to have a one size fits all answer here, and I'll explain why in a second. But typically, when we're talking Dante, when we're thinking Dante, many of us are thinking, okay, at 24-bit 48K sample rate, I'm dealing with 64 channels of audio, and that's because with Dante, it was designed and invented by a third-party company. It's not an open standard. And that company created a piece of software called Dante Controller that you need to download in order to use your network. But that company also has licensed chips that manufacturers purchase and put in their hardware. And depending on which chip is in the hardware will determine how many channels of Dante that piece of hardware will do. So a Dante stream is a little bit, well, it is hardware dependent. But most of us, when dealing with Dante, we're thinking like, okay, a church or a digital console or a DSP system like QSys or a Biamp with a Dante card. And we're sort of like each Dante port is 64 channels. And again, that's hardware dependent because I can buy a little mic input wall box that's Dante and it's only 2 channels because of the chip that it has. So, trying to define a Dante stream with one sentence is kind of difficult because it really depends on the hardware. But when we're dealing with Dante ports on consoles and stage racks, usually you're dealing with at 24-bit 48K up to 64 channels, and you get another port for another 64 channels. If you're dealing with a wall box, a mic plate, a little 1 or 2 input thing, then we're dealing with just 2 channels. network example of Dante is very similar to AVB. You have your Dante senders and receivers all connected with layer 3 switches. You open up the software known as Dante controller. It will see all of these devices on the screen and allow you to route audio between them. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a moment. So Dante enables transmission, and I sort of belabored this point a minute ago, 64 channels bidirectionally at 24-bit 48K. So when you see a Dante port, it's one connector. There's 64 channels in and 64 channels out. Now, Dante is extremely popular today because Audinate has done a brilliant job licensing their technology to hundreds and hundreds of audio video companies. So you as an integrator, as an audio engineer, and anything in between will probably can find a solution with Dante on it, whether it be a mixer, even a microphone, a headphone, preamp, a stage box, a mic preamp, a converter. You can find solutions with Dante much more readily. And that is an advantage. That is definitely an advantage that Dante has. Here's an example of what Dante controller looks like. It's a piece of software. You go to Audinate's website, audinate.com. You download this. It's free. You just have to register your email address. You download it. And the primary screen that you will live in most of the time is this routing screen where you can see all of your senders and receivers and you can route the audio between them. You also can go to device info. You can do clock status and do troubleshooting. But once you got everything up and running, this is where you're going to spend the most of your time. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to not go into the weeds on this because we could do a whole webinar just on Dante controller and all the things that you can do here. The purpose of this webinar is to understand the basic differences between Dante, AVB, and MADI, and which one of those networks is best suited for your particular application or your particular project. Now, another piece of the puzzle you need to know about for Dante is Dante Virtual Sound Card. There's a couple of other things like Dante Domain Manager, and there's a couple other little things that Audinate has. But for purposes of today, this is a critical piece to understand. Dante Virtual Sound Card will turn your computer into a Dante audio interface. It's a virtual audio interface. So there's no hardware. You don't need to go get an audio interface with USB 3 or a PCI Express card. Now, people do, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but Dante Virtual Sound Card is a convenient way to have simple recording and media playback from the computer to your network. It is my opinion that it's not suitable for the following situations where you need very low latency, where you need redundancy. That's not an opinion, that's just fact. If you need external clock or you have a high channel count, especially on the playback side, which for live sound can be quite an issue. And there are inherent situations with Dante Virtual Sound Card where we recommend a Dante audio interface instead. Now, Dante is compatible to something known as AS67, which is an Audio Engineering Society standard. There is no license fees to adopt AS67, but Dante is a proprietary technology that runs on top of AS67. Thus, the two are compatible. So let me summarize what I would describe as a very high-level comparison between the three formats. And they all have their advantages. You really want to decide for your project which one is best suited. Now, this is not an exhaustive comparison, but this gives you some of the highlights. With MADI, it's 64 channels. There's a MADI input. There's an output, 2 cables. With AVB and Dante, there's 1 cable, 128 channels, up to 192, because the sample rate situation with MADI and AVB is very similar to, say, ADAT light pipe. If I double the sample rate, say from 48K to 96K, the channel count gets cut in half. So my 64 channel MADI network is now 32, and the same is true with Dante. With AVB, the sample rate will not cut the channel count in half. We also can have different sample rates on an AVB network where Dante and MADI have to be 1 sample rate for the entire network. The open standard comparison basically is reflected typically in the price of the product because the license fee might be passed on to the consumer. MADI is going to have the fastest quick setup time, which is why we typically see it in tour sound and live broadcast. That's not to say that AVB and Dante don't occur in those situations, but it's less often. So MADI is still widely used today for that reason. AVB has reserved bandwidth, and because of that, AVB can be used on an existing computer network provided the switches are AVB compatible. And because of that, you actually don't have to set up an entirely different network. Also, with MADI, it's plug and play. You just outputs to inputs, just like analog gear, and that has its advantages in certain applications. With AVB and Dante, you're dealing with switches and configuring a network, and it does add a whole nother layer of understanding that may or may not be an advantage for you depending on what you're doing. However, with that configuration and management with AVB and Dante, you have centralized configuration, meaning I can sit at a computer terminal and do everything right there. And that also is an advantage depending on which way you're looking at it. MADI's point to point, AVB and Dante are connecting switches to your hardware. They're both compatible with Mac and PC. And, it could be argued that this last point is evolving every day. Typically, we see MADI in broadcast and tour sound. We see AVB in automotive and other commercial situations. And we see Dante in a lot of live and house of worship, and definitely in the install market. So let's talk a little bit about some other factors. So we have MADI, we have Dante, we have AVB. We obviously still have some digital audio like AES-EBU and SPDIF and those types, and then analog. So what's the missing link for AV professionals now? Well, the missing link is being able to connect anything with everything, understanding what your options are when building a system centered in any of these technologies. And many systems are hybrids, they have several of these technologies in there. So I want to share with you some solutions that you might want to know about that can work for you depending on what you're doing. First one I want to share is in the area of personal monitoring, and that is a company by the name of MyMix. MyMix has recently added Dante capability. So each one of these personal monitor mixers can be put on in a MyMix network, and that network can be connected to a Dante network. And the MyMix mixers themselves can choose any 16 channels off the network that it sees. You also have things like level, tone, effects, and pan. On the side of the unit, there's also built-in recording, so you can actually record multi-track to the SD card. Now, personal monitoring is sort of its own product category unto itself, and arguably we could do an hour conversation about personal monitoring and all the factors that going into personal monitoring. But what we wanted to share with you here is if you are looking for a personal monitor solution that is brand agnostic, meaning it will work with any system that's compatible with MADI or Dante or AVB even, you would need a converter for the AVB, but MyMix provides Dante and MADI solutions right out of the box. This is a great system because it's not tied to what the mixing desk brand is. And you would typically set a MyMix system up in this way, where you have your MyMix Dante heart right here at the top, connected to your Dante network over on the right, and then your MyMix network is on the left. If you have questions and you're interested to learn more about MyMix, just send me an email, which I'll be sharing at the end of this webinar. I'll also put my email address on the social media chat. Now, I talked a little bit a moment ago about audio interfaces and Dante Virtual Sound Card. Two audio interfaces you're going to want to know about for sure, no matter who you are or what kind of projects you do, are made by a company by the name of RME, and that is the DigiFace Dante and the DigiFace AVB, whether you're dealing with an AVB network or a Dante network. Now, we also have a MADIFace USB, and one of the folks on the live stream said he has a MADIFace Pro. So we have a MADI solution that's an audio interface. We have several, actually. We have a Dante solution and we have an AVB solution. And every one of those solutions have some very important benefits that you're going to want to consider. Number one, when we talk about Dante or AVB, Dante Virtual Sound Card does have some problems. And people will tell you, if you're looking for global mixing and a stable word clock and very low latency and redundancy, you're going to have to go beyond Dante Virtual Sound Card and consider a hardware audio interface solution. And that's where the Digiface Dante may come into play. You also, with AVB, there's really no virtual audio interface. So you need some kind of AVB to USB 3 or PCI Express solution. So the Digiface series is perfect for that. Also, these are bus powered. They're USB 3, not USB 2. So we can do hundreds of channels. So we can do sample rates up to 192. They do 128 channels of audio in both directions. And this is the true benefit. And this is the slide I wanted to get to. TotalMix FX is built into these devices. Whether you have a MADIFace Pro, MADIFace USB, Digiface Dante, Digiface AVB, it really doesn't matter. You have, you have this matrix mixer that is going to be very powerful for you. So in the case of a Dante or AVB network, for example, as soon as I connect these interfaces to the network, I've just inserted a 128 channel matrix mixer into the network. So for those that are very comfortable and understand Dante controller, this is like having faders and metering in a patch bay. So we have metering of the channels, we can do summing and busing, and essentially, as the slide says, we have unlimited mixing and routing just in the audio interface. And since most audio networks generally have a computer, not just for configuration, but for some form of playback and or recording, you need an interface anyway. And now you've added this summing, busing matrix capability without putting a physical mixer in your network. So that makes this extremely powerful. Also, there's a feature called TotalMix Remote for accessing the interface remotely. You also have precision metering tools, so you can literally set up phase correlation meter, spectral analyzer. You can have very high precision meters for every Dante channel. None of this comes with a Dante network. So this is all additional benefits for adding that one product, that Digiface Dante or AVB, for example. So all of this is available with that. So extremely important to walk away from this webinar knowing that if you're going to use Dante or AVB, you might want to consider one of those interfaces. And if you're using MADI, you're going to want to consider the MADI version. So for an audio network, the benefits of TotalMix is metering and remote control, level control, summing, busing, routing, even zero latency monitoring, because these units have headphone monitor outputs that you can literally avoid having the audio go process through the computer if you're using any kind of archive or DAW software. So the Digiface Dante specifically, hang on one second here, looks like this. It's got 4 network ports on it. You can set it up as a 4-port switch, so you don't even need to use a switch, or you can use it as a primary switch and a secondary switch with 2 ports. So that is set up in the Fireface USB settings. There's a BNC for word clock. You can also have that be MADI. So this unit actually does 64 channels of Dante and 64 channels of MADI at the same time. And as you can see, it's USB 3. The reason you see a power connection there, it does ship with an external power supply. You only need that if you want to use it as a standalone 1-to-1 Dante to MADI converter. Now, there's also in the realm of Dante, another product you might want to know about, which is something from Digigram called an LX Dante. I share this with you because there are situations where folks want to use and set up a Dante network with Linux. And it's hard to find audio interface solutions that work well on Linux. This is such a solution. So if you're doing a hospital or military or flight simulator where Linux is the OS and it's not Windows, this does work on Windows, by the way. But if it's not Mac, but it's Windows or Linux, this might be another choice to put it in your server. Now, the Digiface AVB is basically like the Digiface Dante, just for AVB. The one exception to that is that the BNC word clock is just word clock. It does not do MADI. All right, so what about some microphone preamps? Because when we do networks, typically we need microphone preamps. We don't always have a big console as part of the equation. Well, there are some ones you're going to want to know about. They all share this in common. They have some sort of web GUI that you can use to route and control. And since many of these solutions I'm going to share with you also have MADI ports and ADAT ports, they're like digital patch bays as well. And so all of that can be done with the routing that you see below. First one I want to share with you is a group of digitally controlled preamps from RME called the 12 mic and the AVB tool. They have reference class mic pre's, 128 channels of AVB plus 120 channels of MADI. And I'm going to show you some Dante versions of this in a minute. And then also we have redundant ports, single multi-mode MADI capability with the SFP modules, redundant AC and DC power supply, pretty powerful and sort of a router unto itself. If you're looking for a microphone preamp with Dante, Ferrofish is getting ready to introduce something known as an M16, which is 16 channels of mic ins to Dante. And it has 8 reference class, 16 DA, AD, 8 DA, 8 at IO, remote control, pretty powerful as well. Another category of solutions you're going to want to know about are some converters that convert Dante, MADI, AVB, and even other formats. So things like the M32 or the M16, which can do 16 or 32 analog to digital, or the same back to analog. We also have a flagship piece from Ferrofish that you might want to know about, which gives you 32 channels of analog in and out, 64 channels of MADI, 64 channels of Dante, 32 channels of ADAT, all in a single 1RU space. So that's another solution that's good to know. And we also have it in 1/4-inch configuration, something known as a Pulse 16. So again, I'm not expecting people to remember model numbers here. This is more of a walk away knowing what's available, knowing what's out there, and how it might be implemented. What about digital format conversion and sample rate conversion? Because once we're in the digital domain, there are situations that come up that you need to convert the sample rate. Well, there's a company by the name of Apsys that makes something known as the multiverter, MVR64. You can see on this slide that it has a lot of different digital formats that it can convert to and from. There's also an onboard sample rate converter that we can do asynchronous sample rate conversion of one sample rate to another as we're going from one format to another. There's also reasons where you might not convert the sample rate. Let me say it differently. You might have a 48 kilohertz sample rate Dante network in an auditorium, and you might have broadcast trucks doing a broadcast of what's going on in that auditorium, and it's also running 48K Dante. And you might want to break the clock. In other words, have both enterprises share audio between them, but not be on each other's clock. So that's another reason you might want a sample rate converter. In addition to the multiverter, Apsys is getting ready to introduce these flexiverters, which are these boxes that you can actually add to a multiverter and do even more digital format conversion. So there's a flexiverter Dante, flexiverter MADI, flexiverter AES3, flexiverter AES50, AES67. And you can take a flexiverter and use it in one of these 3 ways. You might connect a flexiverter to a multiverter and add some format conversion that isn't native to the multiverter out of the box. You might take 2 flexiverters and connect them together and create a 1-to-1 converter and essentially create a product that doesn't exist yet. You might also choose to use a flexiverter by itself as a standalone converter. And that's because the flexiverter line also has auxiliary cards that you can put on the back. And you can put these auxiliary cards in to an existing flexiverter and just use it standalone. So I could take a flexiverter AES50 and put an auxiliary Dante card in it and make a very low cost, high quality, reliable solution. And so there's a lot of different ways these flexiverters can be strung together with the multiverter, with each other, or by themselves. So I can have a multiverter and add flexiverters to it. I can take a flexiverter on the left, connect it to a flexiverter on the right, and make a very specific application and install it. Or I could take a flexiverter and a standalone and add any of these auxiliary cards. All right. So we've spent enormous amount of time talking about what MADI offers, what Dante offers, what AVB offers. I've given you some solutions you might want to know about that you can add to your network and solve specific problems. But I think the next portion of this webinar, we're going to just show you some different application setups of what you can achieve using these solutions. I'm going to start with a very simple setup. Let's say I have a Digiface AVB on the right connected to a computer via USB 3. And that Digiface AVB provides me with 128 channels of audio in and out of the computer. It provides me with 128 by 128 by 128 matrix, audio matrix, 128 channels of recording and playback, 384 channels of metering, and DigiCheck and TotalMix Remote if I need them. Now on the left, I connect something like an RME AVB tool, which has 128 channels of AVB, 4 channels of very high quality mic pre's, headphone out, line out, and 128 channels of MADI IO. There's a lot just in this little picture. So that creates a very powerful network. You can use that in live sound, recording, studio, production. I could also swap out the AVB tool and put in the 12 mic and literally just run a single Cat5 cable from the primary port into the AVB port. Let's say I want to go Dante. I take the same initial slide with the AVB tool, connect the MADI to the MADI IO of a Digiface Dante. I still have the same capabilities as I did a moment ago, just a little different. And then I'm going USB 3 into my computer. And I have 128 channels of AVB. So think about this for a minute. This picture, while not a lot of equipment here, and these are pretty small units, think about it. You have 120 channels of AVB. You have 64 channels of Dante here. You have 64 channels of MADI. You have 128 channels of recording and playback. You have 128 channel matrix mixer. This is an extremely powerful setup here. Swap it out for a 12 mic, add another 12 mic. Now we're going MADI out into MADI in. We're using that daisy chain signal embedding we talked about, going into the MADI IO. And for the gentleman on the YouTube stream who has a MADI face USB, you could also use the SFP module and use optical and go into your MADI face USB. This unit also has Dante ports. So now I can add something like a Farafish Pulse 16 or A32 or some other Dante device to the Dante ports. And I have 4-port switch here. So think about how powerful this becomes with just these simple things. Let's say I want to put a Digiface Dante in a multi-room facility. I now have the power to replace Dante Virtual Sound Card with something that gives me mixing, routing, flexibility, redundancy, word clock, and MADI IO. I also can use it with something with like the popular NewTek TriCaster or similar. I can use it for a small PA and use it to handle all of my playback and recording. And if I wanted to, though it wasn't designed for this, people do it. You can use TotalMix as a virtual mixer, and you could use it on an iPad, use TotalMix Remote and do it on an iPad and not even have a physical mixer in this small setup. We also could take a larger setup for live sound, like a house of worship. And we have our playback and recording computer here connected via USB 3, connected to Dante. Everything else is tied in. We can record playback, do our playback tracks, do our recording, and even use TotalMix if we need to as more busing and routing and summing if our mixer runs out of matrix capability. We might even want to do for something like tour sound, where we have our laptop connected via a Dante and we're using this for very stable, low latency recording and playback. And then we're also taking advantage of the fact that we have our BNC MADI maybe connected to one console and then the Dante connected to another console. So one might be the monitor mixer, the other could be the front of house mixer. We already showed my mix, but in many cases with a personal monitoring setup, you might want to use the DigiFace Dante or AVB and TotalMix to handle some of the submixing that might be needed. You could take something like one of those Dante converters. The Pulse 16 DX is what we're showing here. And the reason we're showing it is it has so much 1/4-inch IO. So I can go out of it into my personal monitoring transmitters, which you see down here, and I could go out of it into my power amps, because a lot of times with stage boxes and snakes and those types of setups, we never have enough outputs at the stage. This is a great example of how this might be used. We also have analog inputs, so we could connect any of our wireless mic receivers that are not Dante compatible to the Pulse 16's balanced analog ins, and now make my wireless mic system Dante compatible for a fraction of the price. Lots of ways this could be used. Anywhere I have a high concentration of analog IO, I could connect and go with short analog cabling into the Pulse and then into Dante. Dante to AVB conversion is becoming more and more common and more requested. There's several ways to do it. This is one of 3 or 4 examples. In this example, we're showing a Meyer system connected to an M32 Pro via AVB, and then we're using MADI and the DigiFace Dante. The new FlexiVerters, the multiverter would be another way to do this. And to the gentleman's comment online, yeah, the FlexiVerter is definitely cool. Um, you know, the MADIFace Pro to Dante, that would be a great way to do it. Another thing you could do is potentially, go with a DigiFace Dante and just use it as a standalone MADI to Dante converter. Uh, Ferrofish also makes something called a Virtu MX. It's a half rack box, and that also gives you the capability of doing MADI to Dante. In addition to that, we could do courtroom setups with Dante and AVB, and the list is endless. So if you are here, first of all, I want to thank everyone for attending. This is not a replay of an earlier session. This is a session on audio networking. The earlier session today was doing reliable audio over unreliable networks. We're just finishing up the audio networking session. For those of you that have been here from the beginning, if you want to send me an email with your first and last name, I'd be happy to send you your certificate. Are there any questions on any of the material that we've presented? If for those of you on social media, you can type. For those of you that are here in Zoom, you can certainly use the chat or ask it. Well, all right. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. I hope everyone has a great day. Stay safe. And if you have any questions that you want to ask offline, feel free to send me an email to derek@syntax.com. Thanks again.